I want to welcome everyone to this Bennett-Schmidt lecture on the higher aim of art. And special thanks to Stephen Allen Bennett and Dr. Elaine Melody-Schmidt for underwriting this important lecture series. This program centers itself on the why element of skill acquisition, enabling students to better define their underlying creative perspective. My name is Dan Thompson, and this presentation is called the Atelier Resurgence. It's a panel discussion. It's many, many months in the making, and we have some extraordinary people on this panel with a wealth of knowledge and experience that we can't wait to hear from. I'm going to introduce the speakers first. I'll show some slides of their work, and then we'll go to the panel discussion itself. Starting with Gary Christensen. Gary Christensen.
Hello.
I'm going to introduce you, Gary. Gary Christensen majored in fine arts at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and originally aspired to be a painter. However, after discovering the kind of instruction he was looking for no longer existed, he used his creative talents to have a successful career as a commercial artist. First by doing freelance work, and later, in 1987, he was employed as a senior art director by a nationally recognized direct marketing catalog company. In 2004, he worked at a local design agency, Studio One, as creative director and was later promoted to vice president of the agency's catalog design and photo studio services. Christensen retired in 2010 and turned his attention to completing the catalog raisonné of Richard Lack's works. In 1983, Christensen learned of a local art school that, quote, taught people how to draw and paint realistically in the manner of the old masters. That school was Atelier Lack. He took advantage of their evening classes program, where he was introduced to the heritage of atelier training and the connection of Richard Lack to the old masters by way of his instructor in Boston, R.H. Ives Gammell, and other Boston school painters. Motivated by Lack's work, his atelier, and the connection to the old masters, Christensen used his business experience and creative expertise to partner with Richard Lack and a few of his earliest students to create a national organization in 1988, which stated the purpose of, quote, promoting and preserving the fine craft of picture making. The result was the American Society of Classical Realism, its guild of professional artists, and a lifelong friendship with Richard Lack. During his tenure as ASCR president and publisher, Christensen designed and produced all of the organization's publications, the Classical Realism Journal, that reached thousands of readers in the United States, England, and 12 other countries worldwide, as well as numerous exhibition catalogs for the organization's Guild of Artists. The organization held several exhibitions locally and nationally. Due to a lack of funding, the ASCR had to close its doors in 2005. However, in 2002, with Richard Lack's approval, Christensen began researching and documenting his works that, based upon Lack's records totaling 485 paintings, studies, drawings, sketches, and woodcuts, began his book. After Lack died in October 2009, Christensen discovered over 600 additional works in Lack's studio, with more works in collections that were never documented. The work laid the foundation for what became Richard F. Lack, Catalog Raisonné, 1943 to 2009. Of the 1,600 copies printed, there are only approximately 150 copies for sale today. In addition to completing the research and documenting Mr. Lack's works, Mr. Christensen also designed the publication, photographed half of the reproductions, and executed its desktop production, making it print ready. It was published in 2016 by Afton Press. Consequently, classical realism has become an international art movement. Today, Christensen is fully retired but continues to work on two books, Richard F. Lack Catalog Raisonné Volume 2 and The Imaginative Paintings of Richard Lack and Their Studies. And the book is currently available at the atelier.org/store. Our next panelist is Carl J. Samson. Carl Samson began his serious study of art at the age of 14 with Alan R. Banks in Sandusky, Ohio. In 1979, he moved to Boston for a unique and rare opportunity to study under one of America's finest painters, Boston school descendant R.H. Ives Gammell, 1883 to 1981. After Gammell's death in 1981, Carl moved to Minneapolis to continue his studies with Richard Lack, one of the most significant American realists of the second half of the 20th century. Carl is a repeat winner at the prestigious National Portrait Competition, seizing both the Grand Prize Grand Standen Award for Excellence in Portrait Painting and the Portrait Institute Award for Distinguished Achievement in Portrait Painting. He was one of 5 Americans invited to visit and paint with the Union of Russian Artists in Moscow, and has lectured and demonstrated painting at the Metropolitan Museum of Art as a distinguished guest of honor for the American Society of Portrait Artists, ASAPA. He also served on ASAPA's International Advisory Board as vice chairman of their governing board, and then was unanimously elected chairman of the American Society of Portrait Artists Governing Board. Samson's groundbreaking Triumph of Truth received the Phil Descend Award for Most Outstanding Representational Painting at the Butler Institute of American Art, and his portrait of Natalie Portman as Padme resplendent with Nabu Mandala in the collection of George Lucas was published in Star Wars Art Visions. His work has been purchased by the Cincinnati Art Museum and has been the subject of numerous articles in a variety of media, including American Artist, International Artist, The Artist Magazine, and American Artist Painting Video Magazine. A video of his 1-hour-long Metropolitan Museum of Art portrait demonstration was produced by the American Society of Portrait Artists Foundation. Samson's critical eye has been further recognized as judge of numerous international and national exhibitions and competitions. He's given slide lectures and painting demonstrations to museums, colleges, and art organizations, and has been a guest artist in various art associations throughout the United States. His expert observations on paintings by Rembrandt, Twachtman, Duveneck, and Monet were recorded on 2 random access masterpiece audio guides for the Cincinnati Art Museum. Carl was a contributor to the Classical Realist Journal and the author of several articles on painting for the Artist Magazine. He and wife Carol co-wrote an article on Herman Wessel's murals for the inaugural issue of Salon America Journal. Carl is a full member of the Guild of American Society of Classical Realism, advisor to and founding member of Green Acres Artist Guild, Louis and Louise Nippert Foundation, a past member of the American Society of Portrait Artists, the Cincinnati Art Club, and the Valley View Nature Preserve, and he has advised the board of the Frank Duveneck House and Museum. Our next panelist is Richard Whitney. Richard Whitney is an American painter, author, and educator. Town and Country magazine has named him one of the top dozen portrait painters in America. Fine Art Connoisseur has called him one of the giants of the field of figurative painting. Whitney's portraits and landscapes hang in over 800 public and private fine art collections worldwide. They include the Anchorage Museum of Art and History, the Anderson House Museum, the Newark Museum, the Pentagon, Harvard, Yale, and Stanford universities, and the Catholic University of Portugal. He has won over 40 regional and national awards, as well as 3 grants from the Elizabeth Grainshields Foundation of Montreal. Whitney was awarded an honorary Doctor of Fine Arts from the University of New Hampshire in 2015. Dr. Whitney is the author of the book, Painting the Visual Impression, which summarizes the basic principles of representational painting. First published in 1972, it has been read by thousands of artists worldwide. He is also co-author of the book, Realism in Revolution, The Art of the Boston School. His paintings have been reproduced in the book, Edmund C. Tarbell and the Boston School of Painting. Whitney graduated Phi Beta Kappa from the University of New Hampshire in 1968. He studied with Sidney F. Willis and the eminent Boston painter R.H. Ives Gammell for 5 years. Whitney's paintings have been seen on national cable television and have been the subject of numerous newspaper and magazine articles. He has traveled and painted in Europe, Japan, Alaska, and the Caribbean, and has lectured and conducted workshops throughout the United States. He is listed in many reference books, including Who's Who of American Art, Who's Who in America, Who's Who in the 21st Century. Whitney and his artist wife, Sandy Sherman, live on Crescent Pond in Stoddard, New Hampshire. And this is an image of Richard's book, which is available on crescentpond.com and also richardwhitneyportraits.com. And I've read the book. I've had a copy for 25, going on 30 years, and it's amazing. Our final panelist is Darren Kingsley. Darren Kingsley is an instructor and Studio Incaminati alumnus whose paintings are in the collections of Lucasfilm Limited, the film production company founded by Star Wars creator George Lucas, and the Union League of Philadelphia, as well as numerous private collections. He is the recipient of numerous awards and residencies, including first place at the Grand Central Academy of Art Drawing Competition in 2010. a Forbes Foundation and American Artist Residency in 2006, American Society of Classical Realism Scholarship in 2000, American Artist Magazine's Realism Today in 2000. And he's shown in Freeman's Auction House in Philadelphia for many years, the Figure Now exhibition in Fontbonne University in St. Louis in 2011, as well as the Hudson River Landscape School in 2008. His teaching experience includes being an assistant for Nelson Shanks, the portrait and figure drawing instructor at the Atelier in Minneapolis from 2000 to 2001, many BACA workshops, that's the Bay Area Classical Artists Atelier in San Francisco since 2013, Grand Central Academy of Art workshops in New York from 2011 up to the present, various workshops around the country, as well as serving as an instructor, mentor, level chair, and I have to say, revered faculty member at Studio Incominati since 2005. Gentlemen, I want to thank you, and I look forward to this conversation. I really appreciate your presence. And to the audience, thank you all for being here, especially to Susanna Lack, who I believe is joining us today. And if she is, welcome, Susan Lack.
And if I may, a special greeting from me to Susanna Lack. Hi, Susanna.
Outstanding. Excellent. Well, it looks like we're waiting for Richard to come back on. So I'll start the conversation with a question. And I want to preface these questions by saying we're trying to get a little more deeply into what is happening in our education. If we don't know where we came from, we won't know where we're going. So I'd like to turn the first question to Darren, please. Darren, you've spoken very perceptively about your own studies in both Atelier Lack as well as at Studio Incominati, especially on a school of drawing versus a school of painting. Your presence at SI bridges between those two schools and is already being emulated by students. Would you discuss the notion of an atelier as opposed to a school, please? And where you see the atelier system today as opposed to a few decades ago?
Ateliers, when I began studying, were fairly strictly studying under a single teacher, so it was a process of finding a teacher that you wanted to paint like, and you would go there to study with them, which is a very, very valid method of working. It can be very limiting too, because you're only studying with one person, so you're only going to get what they want to give out of that process. So it can be very useful because it's focused on a single method of working. When I started the Atelier, I started there after Richard Lack retired. So I studied there with his students, with Dale Redpath and Sid Wicker. And James Robinson was a teacher there when I was studying there as well. And it was a very drawing focused program. So we spent quite a bit of time in the first few years really doing pencil drawings, graphite drawings, and charcoal drawings and that kind of thing. Before we got into painting, which was very useful in terms of really building a solid base to work on. There's a lot of ateliers that have kind of evolved out of that system that they don't quite fit into the atelier mold anymore. Studio Incominati is definitely one of them. And a lot of other ones that are kind of popping up at this point now don't quite fit into the atelier mold anymore. They're more schools of art that have multiple teachers in them, and certain teachers may focus on drawing, certain teachers might focus on color, certain teachers might focus on painting and different things. But it's sort of an evolution of that, but it's a different type of school for sure.
I'm really interested in what you're saying. I am reminded of some of the things that you talked about regarding other schools. And, in Atelier, I'll raise one example: the Art Students League of New York, which is comprised of something like 70 ateliers, as it is called. And although it is the right term for what's going on, that is, you come in and work under this one individual, as you said, there are a lot of people oftentimes in those classes, and that's kind of counter to the whole concept, isn't it?
To the concept of an atelier?
In the sense that you're in a really intensive environment with someone. When you fill it up with lots and lots of individuals, it can become far less intensive, it seems to me.
It can, for sure. There are certainly a lot of colleges, and you know, the Art Students League is to me seems somewhere in between. When I left Minnesota, I moved to New York to study at the Art Students League with Nelson Shanks, and I didn't last there very long because it was very unorganized when I was there.
Mm-hmm.
It was very unorganized when I was there.
When I taught there, it was also unorganized, and part of it was, it's certainly the teachers' issues that was my fault, but part of it is also when people are entering at different degrees of experience.
Yeah.
You know, some people are, they can barely figure out which end of the brush to hold, and others are far more, you know, thoroughly versed on where to go with it. So I agree with you. Yes, Gary, go ahead.
If I may make a comment, I noticed that I would like to note that the Atelier, which where Darren studied with Sid and Dale early on, has become more of an art academy and art school. And they've done that out of necessity financially. They need more students to be able to support the cost of rent and other facets according to what they do and what their needs are. But they have handled it very well with bringing on very good trained people to teach some of the classes and to kind of break things up. Now, I feel that that's going to be probably ongoing, and I think good art education can come from that. But as you pointed out, Dan, if the classes get too large, then you're not getting the focus and the attention of the instructor that's required. So that always has to be kept in balance. But ultimately, I see the atelier system rising to the top of that, and where artists can pursue a specific painter to study with. And it can be a very small class, maybe no more than 12 students. Now, to support that, there'd have to be financing. Gammell was independently wealthy, and he didn't even charge his students. In fact, in many ways, he put them up and covered their expenses. So that could still happen, but that's going to be the exception and not the rule. So ultimately, there's going to have to be something worked out where the atelier system can survive and financially be supported.
I appreciate that. One of the reasons why I'm asking is because the word atelier, from my perspective, seems to be thrown around quite a bit these days as you know, you might see the word structure or you know, some other thing where it sort of gets pulled from its original connotation into something else, and people say atelier, but they don't really seem to associate it with what its original intent is. And I'm not saying that they have to go back and do that. I just want to be really clear on what we're talking about. And it sounds like we are talking about the evolution of a school from one point of view to many points of view, to a core of people who are profoundly expert at what they're teaching their students.
Yeah, professional painters. It still
Right.
needs to be run and operated by professional painters.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. I think we've almost got you there, Richard. Except you're muted. Let's see if we can get you unmuted. Hold on. Let's see if we can help Richard. And let me move the next question to Carl for a second here. Hey, Carl.
Yes.
So I pre-wrote a few questions because I wanted to make everybody's time, you know, especially yours, because I appreciate the four of you being here very much, you know, valuable. and worthwhile. And so the question I have for you is referencing Gammell's text, which I have to say, if people don't know it, laid the foundation for the Elizabeth Greenshields Foundation, because Charles Glass Greenshields was in contact with Gammell early on and was deeply inspired by the conclusion of A Twilight of Painting. So he says the two methods, academic and impressionistic, which should have been understood as complementing one another, were regarded as opposed. This passage reads like a call to action to me. How well does that provocative statement reflect your own experience with training as an artist?
Well, I think it's critical. The developments that occurred in the late 19th century, Europe and France, and a little bit more in this country as well afterwards, were such that it sort of started out as an academic exercise with the academies in Paris and in France, and then little by little, with painters like Jules Bastien-Lepage and some others that were beginning to go out into the field and paint outdoors from life, en plein air, as the phrase goes. Those kinds of precepts were being brought into the studio from these students that had originally gone to France and gone to the academies, and they've got their training that was based on fine drawing and form interpretation and accuracy in terms of shape, and also an understanding of anatomy and structure. So what was interesting about that, and I can point to William Paxton as an example, he went over to study with Gérôme, but then he became kind of enamored with what he was hearing about and seeing with other painters who were going off into the fields and painting from, en plein air and in the open air. So he began to bring those precepts in, and I think that created, I think Mr. Gammell called it kind of intellectual indigestion, because on the one hand, he was learning the everything he could from the academies and from Gérôme in terms of fine drawing and structure, anatomy and shape, but also absolutely stricken with the color, atmosphere, and light of the Impressionists. So that was sort of a key moment in the development, I think, of American painting in some ways, because painters like Paxton, and he wasn't the only one that had that experience, brought that back to America, and American Impressionism developed in a slightly different way, that it embraced a little more of the academies than the French Impressionists did, I think. And it used to be said that French Impressionism or European Impressionism kind of dissolved their forms more than American Impressionists did. And I think that's partially because the Americans embraced that early training they had at the academies. So in some respects, that's what makes that Gammell-Lack lineage kind of interesting, is that they, instead of saying, being at odds with each other, they tried to fuse those two things together. It's a very difficult proposition, but when it's done well, it's astounding, because you have a level of veracity and truth, what Stevenson, R.A.M. Stevenson, called the truth that, how did he phrase that? Richard, do you know what that Stevenson quote was about Velázquez and about the painting of lifts truth into poetry, that sort of thing? So in any case, it's that blending of things that was critical. It sounds like Richard is still muted at the moment, but
yeah.
Does that answer your question, Dan, or is that sort of a roundabout kind of trip?
I think it kind of does. It's what I would like to do is connect it to people who are really interested in this tradition, but don't have the depth of knowledge of the four of you. So what we're essentially talking about is that, some people would study form and some people would study color. And Gammell's talking about that as complementary, and that's what you're saying about Gérôme, right? And the question might be, how did you combine those two, the kind of impressionist color and the form, as you were studying in your own study experience?
Well, in a sort of nuts and bolts fashion, there was the importance of embracing various facets of painting, including outdoor painting, that would then help inform your indoor painting. That's with regard to color and light and atmosphere, hitting all those notes in proper relationship to each other, all those edge relationships carefully, and bringing that into the studio then informs your portraiture or your figurative paintings in such a way that it has that scintillating vibration of warm and cool color that helps give something life and interest. And I think that's what happened to me, is embracing all those various facets of painting, from landscape to still life to whatever it is, and all those things help inform each other. So I think the degree to which we start out saying, I'm going to investigate all these various aspects of painting, and then eventually maybe specialize in one particular field, that's going to be the best. One follow-up thing, Dan, when I was involved with the American Society of Portrait Artists, which is now defunct.
Yes.
But when I was involved with it, my platform, if you can call it that, was if your heart's desire is to paint a really fine portrait, to get out there in the open fields and paint in the open air, and design and compose still lifes in your studio. All those things help inform all those other things, so that you're not a one-dimensional painter. You're looking at all the various aspects of what makes for really fine painting.
Like the Sargent quote where he says, become a great painter, right? And not a great portrait painter.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Exactly.
Well, so part of the reason for having this conversation, the purpose, is to clarify a bit more realistically, pun intended, where this tradition's coming from, because it gets a little bit misty for a lot of students as they look back, as I've seen in my experiences as a teacher, where they kind of see their way back to about 1990, but not too far back prior to that time. And I'd like to investigate just how influential the book Twilight of Painting was on what we're practicing today. So I wanted to turn a question toward Richard, if you don't mind.
I'll try.
All right. It's been 76 years since Twilight of Painting was published, a book that Gammell dedicated to those, quote, born or unborn, who might be instrumental in leading a period of reconstruction in the art of painting. So what are your thoughts on when and how this might be realized?
Okay, well, I don't know what was said before, but as far as I'm concerned, the reconstruction of the craft of representational painting is well underway now. I think it's necessary to look back at the art history, to understand what happened to the teaching of painting. And in 1913, the Armory Show was critical in introducing the concept of modernism around the world. Novelty, shock, and rebellion became fashionable styles of art. And without standards, the art world was easily taken over by galleries and art promoters who made fortunes selling art made quickly. Against all odds, a few classically trained painters continued to teach small groups of students the craft of painting. Besides Gammell, there was Brackman, Riley, Simi, and Florence, and Dumont, among others. And their students continued to teach the craft. Among those were Lack, Antigone, Green, Kinsler, Sandin, Schmidt, Sanks, and Frank Mason. Their students continue that tradition today. Fred Ross deserves a great deal of credit for creating the largest online museum of art in the world dedicated to classical realism. The Art Renewal Center, or artrenewal.org, has millions of viewers each year and has inspired countless young people to study the craft of representational painting. For example, in 2001, Fred estimated there were only 14 ateliers worldwide with about 150 students. Today, there are over 75 ateliers and art schools teaching the classical tradition with around 5,000 students worldwide. So I think the future for representational painting looks better today than it ever has in the last 100 years. Does that answer your question at all? I have no idea.
It kind of does answer my question. Let me drill down a little bit on your answer. When you think about, to the extent you've seen the curricula of those ateliers today, how do you feel about the curricula generally, how it's practiced, the teaching of cast, the teaching of painting?
Okay.
Because there are, on the one side, you have art schools, and they generally appear to be just all over the place, eclectic to the point of severe default. And the criticism of some of the atelier schools is that they
Yeah.
they do too much of the same kind of training. Do you think?
Yes.
any-
All right. Let me make some comments.
Sure.
When I studied with Mr. Gammell, of course, it's learning to see the shape. And so we did cast drawings every day, cast drawings. And when we worked on the cast drawing over a period of days, we got to a certain stage where he felt we had learned what we could on that drawing. We started another one. So we continued to make starts, and finally refined them over and over. Never did we spend a week toning the background of a cast or spend 6 months on one cast drawing. That's ridiculous. The idea is to train the eye to see the shape by doing so over and over with new casts so you can get it quickly. And as far as still life painting was essential, with still life painting, we learned how to manipulate paint, and we learned how to see edges. The study of edges is not taught very often. And the fact is a lot of representational painters today know nothing about edges, and their work looks very photographic and flat. And in fact, edges, if you, let's say a coffee cup resting on a table with a shadow cast on the table, the edge of that coffee cup, we know, continues around the edge of the table, but it is indeed lost into the shadow of the cast of the cup. Do you understand what I mean?
I do. Is
Yeah.
that the practice that you
Yes. To
observe?
see visually what's out there.
Right, right.
And
Particularly-
that was his training. That was his basic training for several years. And then as you develop, like Sam Rose was very interested in imaginative, a surrealist painting. So he went that direction. And I left Mr. Gammell to go my own direction. So Gammell's basic function was to teach you to see the shape, the values, and the colors and the edges as they appear when you're looking at the entire image at once, rather than peering at each little piece and copying it. If that answers, does that answer it?
That's
Because
very interesting.
he
And
did-
that to me,
He did not teach much about anatomy other than Richet's anatomy. We would copy Richet's anatomy, pieces of anatomy by memory. But he felt that visually speaking, everybody's anatomy is a little bit different. And here and there, muscle shapes can be different. And if you go after each of those muscles, you're really seeing too much detail rather than the breadth of the thing. If you look at Vermeer, you can see how he just subtly emphasizes the structure of the form. He doesn't go in and like a Michelangelo and sculpture it out. It's a different style.
right. I'd love to hear some other comments on the teaching of Atelier training today.
I don't know.
To Richard Lack, and then Carl, you could jump in because your experience with him. I know that he built on the traditions and the skills that he learned from Gammell, and I think he quite successfully built on that tradition and those skill sets himself, and added to that by introducing more attention to the anatomy without going into a lot of detail about it. But he did encourage his students to learn and study skeletal structure and muscular structure to have a better sense of what they were doing when they're painting the figure and painting clothing over the figure. So Richard did a lot of studies himself along that line. Some of that would be found in the catalog raisonné. Go ahead, Carl.
We even dissected cadavers. The last year I was there, we had access to that through a medical school that allowed us to go. Annette Lesueur was teaching that anatomy program at the time, so that was absolutely pivotal for me. I always said I did my best figure drawing after that cadaver that I saw, because you could really understand muscle insertions and all that very, very critical stuff. And yeah, it was really good.
That's interesting.
I also introduced interior painting, and doing interiors, encourage the students to do that, and would work with them on it when they did kind of on their own, would do an interior. and he would get them outside doing landscapes. They could come and work with him, as well as just on their own and with other instructors. Another friend of his, Don Kestner, who was a very accomplished professional American Impressionist painter, landscape painter, would take students under his wing and take them out, and he would encourage them to study with Don. That he was incredible with his understanding and depiction of outdoor color. So he built on all of that. Was the artist to a number of different ways to build on, to add to their knowledge.
We used to have Don come in, and he would be our color critique guy. You know, every once a month or so, Don would come in and make the rounds and really bring a fresh perspective to things. And I think that was what was interesting about Atelier Lac, as opposed to maybe my experience with Mr. Gammell, was these cross pollination of influences from different people that would come critique your work. And I think that was all to the good.
Yeah, and he also had some of his top students that graduated his program, and even while they were working and studying with him, become teachers. Become some would teach the evening classes with doing the cast drawings and introducing portrait work and figure drawing and so on, as well as during his day studies. I know Stephen Jertz, one of his first 4 students, was very actively involved in instruction at Richard Lac's atelier with his daytime students, and other graduates of his program did likewise.
Darren, I want to ask you, I had a colleague once who was teaching, I think it was in Australia or New Zealand, and she described the aptitude of the student body, the creative aptitude, as a decade or 2 behind what she had seen in the US. And it made me think about, sort of contextualizing atelier training today as opposed to 20 years ago. Have you found it changed a lot over the course of your teaching career? Has the aptitude risen quite a bit?
Certainly the desire for it has grown. It's weaker now than it was when I was a student. In part because of the things we're talking about schools having to grow and ateliers becoming something else. The schools have changed a bit. When I was in school, when I was at the Atelier in Minneapolis, it was a very small school. There were 12 students there at that time, and everybody was just trying to learn one thing. And it seems to me like as these schools kind of grow, they've kind of branched out a bit and gotten a bit sort of specialized in a way, which can be useful. When I studied at Atelier Lac, I went there specifically to learn how to draw. And having graduated from there, I realized that there were things in my painting that were weaker. And that was my main reason for leaving and going to study with Nelson Shanks, because he was sort of balancing out those parts that were weaker. And it seems like the way things work now, you almost have to do that. You have to sort of find someone who's doing something that you want to learn and go and study with that person. But you might not get everything in every school. I have seen quite a few schools recently that have kind of grown, that started out very small and have grown into like bigger and bigger institutions. And you can certainly see the quality of the work go down as that's happened, which is unfortunate.
There's already a question about, and I'll just read the question: if funding is a matter of concern for atelier programs, can we expect more partnerships between universities and atelier schools? How do we maintain the integrity of the atelier system in those cases?
That's always been the big challenge.
If I may, I think it would make a mistake for them to partner with universities because of how embedded modernism is in the university instruction and structure there. It's hard to see them bridging a major gap between that and the type of training that one gets in the ateliers and the smaller art schools that are keeping these traditions in the form of training alive today. Um, I think the funding would have to come from outside. I, and somehow each school and each atelier is going to have to work through those issues on their own. So yeah, I think the school's getting too big, as Darren pointed out, can become a problem because some of their programs begin to get a bit watered down. You need to have just maybe a few, two, three, or four really sound instructors uh, to be able to have maybe a school that's got maybe 18 to 24 students or something of that nature. Going much beyond that, you start to maybe lose some of the core structure and value of what's needed to have a successful program. At least that's in my view.
Yeah, it can certainly be true. Um, I think there are balances in there in terms of art history and things like that. Um,
Mhm.
that which is dangerous on a college level because it does sort of veer modern art. Um, but some of the partnerships that we've had with local colleges, medical colleges, that have allowed us to go and study anatomy have been incredibly valuable. So I think there's a part of it that can work, but it does have to be very carefully controlled.
Well, yeah, there's always going to be an exception, and I'm not really sure of the full instruction that you have there, Dan, at the Incaminati School, and how large your program is. How many students do you have?
Yes, we have approximately 40 to 50 full-time equivalents at this time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it does bring up some really thought-provoking content to hear what you're saying. And I think it has to be very delicately managed, or one does run the risk of losing the
Mm-hmm.
whole issue in the midst of growth. And certainly nobody wants that. But I'm also curious about something else. And that is, when I was a student, I remember encountering people that had been in many of these full-time tenured positions for decades, and they had absolutely no use for anything remotely realistic. And now that we're a few years on, we have far more of those individuals kind of cycling out. And maybe there's a possibility that more open-minded professors are coming into some of those environments, because we're getting applications from teachers who are teaching advanced drawing in some circumstances and very much understand that they're missing fundamentals.
Well, and if I may add to that too, in some cases too, the traditional art form has not necessarily spoken to imaginative work that would include, um, paintings that would be, uh, you know, tied into what's going on in the culture of today. And I think that there's the foundations going back to the academies are still sound, but at the same time, some artists can begin to look at some of that work that's coming out and going, well, that's all been done before. How does it relate to what's going on in the world today? And I think certain artists are doing imaginative works that can speak to that. I know Carl's been working on a project that I'm somewhat familiar with that could speak to that, and at a certain time when he's ready to actually publish that to the world. And I know Richard Lack's work was really way out there with his imaginative paintings uh, and exploring Jungian uh, psychological concepts and precepts in his work. So I'm sure that other artists too. There's Christian painters who are doing Christian paintings. So there are others doing that, but I think that there could be an encouragement of artists to start finding their own voice as they mature as a painter and are ready to be able to tackle that in some of their own interiors and imaginative paintings that can speak to today's generations.
I can riff off of that for a second, Gary. I've always felt that uh, where things really get exciting is where you take the whatever talent you had, you were born with, and you've gotten the best training you could possibly get, and you marry that with uh, your perspective on life and what's happening in today's world. You take those old traditions that are built up for so many decades, and you marry that with things that are happening today, and you've got really interesting possibilities with regard to figurative painting in particular. There are developments that occur in our world that are, well, they could not have been dreamed of 15 or 20 years ago. How can we do paintings that talk about that and that look at those issues? And that's what refreshes and renews an art form, particularly figurative painting, in my view. So that's exciting. Well, one last thing about the Atelier stuff that I think needs to be mentioned too is that uh, all that can ever happen in the type of atelier that we're talking about is you can learn the grammar of painting, and then whatever language you make out of that is up to you. It's up to your character, it's up to your drive, it's up to your energy level and your persistence. And it's a rough field. This is not a walk in the woods, especially early on. It's tough, and you've got to be determined and you got to stick with it. But it's that dedication that's critical.
Yes. Yeah, Richard Lack is a good demonstration of that. I mean, he did a lot of portraiture. I mean, he knew that he knew portraiture would lead to other works and selling other works, and from that, he sold some of his landscapes and still lifes and florals to the subjects of his portraits and their wives. Their wives would come to their portrait sittings and talk with Mrs. Lack and see this beautiful work up on the walls. And she would say, I'd like to buy that painting. I could use that in my living room. So they started selling works right off the wall because of that funnel, and starting with building something on the basis of portrait work until he was able to support himself and his family through his work. And it took a few years to do that. It wasn't until later he was able to really focus on some of his imaginative paintings.
When I did a portrait sitting here, I would hang a landscape. They'd have to look in that direction at the landscape. And about 40–50% of the time, they ended up buying that landscape as well.
That's good.
In Twilight of Painting, Gammell makes a significant issue with how much subject matter became an emphasis of painting, and that painters really wanted the pure form of it. They wanted the feeling of sort of a creative high as they were making something, irrespective of the subject matter for a while. And it wasn't that the subject matter was unimportant, it's that it became really hyped by various instruments of commerce related to art.
My favorite story about that is, and Richard might know this one, Mr. Gammell did a still life with a red screwdriver in it. And, if you would go through a museum with a curator and that painting happened to be hanging on the wall, or a docent who would be talking about it, oftentimes, I mean, there's a lot of good that comes from those kinds of tours. But what I hear often is the red screwdriver, it has to mean something. It has to have a subtle, mysterious aspect to the subject that helps inform your understanding of this piece. Whereas Mr. Gammell just needed a spot of red,
right.
And that's the kind of thing that I think is sort of a nuts and bolts craft aspect of looking and designing and composing, apart from what things represent that people lose sight of too often.
When Sam Rose studied with Mr. Gammell for about 11 years and I worked beside Sam for over a period of 5 years, and he would do these imaginative interiors. And I'd say, hey, Sam, what is that about? He says, I have no idea. I'm just painting things that historians and critics argue over what they mean. I have no idea what it means.
So then what do you say to one of these emerging artists who's at a kind of advanced student place coming out and dealing with some of that, where the market or the collector or the galleryist embraces the subject matter wholeheartedly and doesn't pay that much attention to the form, and the artist almost feels guilty that maybe their head is miswired or their sentiments are off where they should be in terms of you know, the subject matter and what they feel deeply about, which is the grammar.
Mhm.
What do you think? What would you say to them?
You find your way. I mean, you do what you can, and the overarching important thing for me personally is to be true to yourself.
Yes.
Don't try to paint like this person or that person. Try to have your own authentic response to the visual world, and how beautiful or poetic it is, or how exciting, or but painting like somebody else, or painting for a market, it's necessary in a lot of ways, but if you can strike a balance between those things that are financially remunerable and those things that you really want in your heart to do, that's the challenge. And I think that's the challenge with writers and dancers and everybody else.
I'm best known as a portrait painter because Mr. Gammell said I had a great talent as a portrait painter, but my heart is really in landscape painting. If I didn't have to make a living, I would certainly do a lot more in the field of landscape painting instead. But I paint portraits primarily to make a living. Once in a while, I have a subject where I can really create something, the background and so forth. I can really create something that I get really excited about. But I get very tired of painting a business. It's one of the most boring things in the world to paint. I look back at Holbein, painting Henry VIII, a homely fat man, but look at the costumes. I mean, you can't miss doing a spectacular painting if the costume or the surroundings of the person are really wonderful.
Yes, Gary, go ahead.
In case we would like to kind of wrap up the atelier training, because we're beginning to go into other topics, I think it would be timely to end off on the last question regarding that you have had for me, question number 5, that I think would kind of put a cap on the atelier training program that highlights some interesting aspects of LAC's program.
Sure. Well, I can ask it. I've worked with many students, all of whom show an interest in the history of traditional study, yet do not understand necessarily where it came from. Would you please discuss how you believe R.H. Ives Gammell influenced the curriculum? And we're talking about the original 1971 curriculum because it's of great interest in this conversation.
Well, and that kind of goes back to something that we've really covered in many ways, but he really built his school on the training that he received from Ives Gammell and brought to it some of the elements that he thought needed to be interjected into it. And so this built over a period of time, but the foundation goes back to that academic training that goes all the way back to the French academies and the academies prior to that, and ultimately to the Renaissance, the master pupil apprenticeship type form of training artist.
That was the very best, of course.
Yeah, and if you can find one painter that's willing to take you under his wing or her wing for a number of years to really get you thoroughly immersed, I mean, that would be where you love their work and you want to have them do that. That would be wonderful, but I don't think that's very realistic today.
Well, N.C. Wyeth took Andrew Wyeth out of school at age 14, taught him how to paint. I mean, that is very rare, but that is a ideal situation. When you get a gifted young person at an early age, then you have a chance to really produce a great artist with a very high degree of skill. The younger you get them, the same with pianists. They start at age 5 or 6. Mm-hmm. If they haven't started at that early age, they're not going to make the highest ranks. No way.
Yeah, and another question to me would be, I think, appropriate at this time.
Well, I wanted to get into a little more of the specifics because I understand from reading in your amazing book, Gary, that a program was set up which prioritized figure painting. I was curious about the length of the poses and the routine of the day-to-day, given what Richard said earlier about not getting too far into the cast, of really seeing the cast more holistically.
I think one that, like Carl might be able to speak to that more directly to me because I've not experienced Richard Lack's posing and how long they would last. I know that he had several different, models that would come in and pose. The poses would last a certain amount of time and then give the model a break. But how long one pose would be held over a number of days. Carl, can you speak to that?
Well, there were the small pencil drawings, and then there were the figure paintings. And once you had enough of those pencil drawings under your belt, you could have a whack at a good sized figure painting, maybe 24, 30 inches high. And you would the model would come, maybe I seem to remember 20, 25, 30 times, 3 hours each time, posing 25, resting for 10, something like that, alternating throughout that period. And again, the main thing that main concern is the truthful color and value notation, truthful edge relationships. It was all about truth, a search for truth, because that's the most beautiful. It's the most poetic for a certain kind of painter. Now, there are other painters who aren't as concerned with that, and that's fine. There's room for everybody in this world, but for certain ones that are born for that dedication to truth, man, to have that kind of time with a figure model was extraordinary. And it was Mr. Gammell used to say that you've got all the time there is, as a young student. So you shouldn't feel rushed. You should just concern yourself with doing the best possible job you could do.
I understand that, and I'm asking, and I'd like the audience to also understand that it's very interesting when you're looking at curriculum where you can overstress a discipline, where you can have too much time on something, as we talked about with the casts. Looking back at the Art Students League, there appears to be a routine in Mowbray's class for drawing of 20-hour poses per week. And, there have been situations I've investigated with other colleagues where we've gone to 80 hours, and it was obviously too long, but the way it becomes too long is interesting in the training of an artist. How much is not enough time, how much is just the right amount of time, and what can one emphasize? So the one thing that really stands out from my reading of all the texts that you all wrote was memory drawing, which we don't see very much today. Could you speak to that a little bit? Any of you?
Well, I can introduce what I know of it that Richard Lack shared with me, that he learned memory drawing with Gammell, and what Gammell would do, and this actually follows Degas' reference in the book that Gammell published on Degas, that to have a student work on seeing a cast first, beginning with cast, would set up a cast and would study it and look at it, try to memorize as much of it as he could or she could, and then go upstairs to the second story studio that they had and begin to draw it. And then they would go back downstairs after looking at their drawing and go back downstairs and compare the drawing to the cast and keep doing that, going upstairs and downstairs until eventually they felt that they had it done, and then they bring the drawing down and set it by the cast and see how successful they were. And they would keep doing that until they got more and more successful. Richard trained his eye to do memory paintings. There's a whole series of them included in the catalog, spread throughout, that he did by memory. And he wished that he had taught memory drawing more to the students that he had. He feels that's the one area that he is disappointed that he didn't include more of, because it's incredible. And in sharing this with me, with our many discussions, I got together with him every week for lunch for years, and he was talking about memory painting, and he said, when I asked him, what's so important about it early on, to try to get an understanding why it was important to be able to do that. And he said, well, you take a look at the old masters and like the 19th century painters who did these charging cavalries. How do you think they did that? They would go out to where the cavalries were practicing and they would memorize the charging horses. and they would go back and memorize other horses in other poses. And they were able to do a very successful painting of horses charging that it looked like it was painted on site.
Mhm.
And they might take a canvas there and do some touch up here and there, who knows? But no, they did it all by memory. So that's the importance of it and what you can do with a very well-trained memory.
I'll
And
add one,
the
one,
go
one,
ahead.
one quick thing.
Yeah.
The first week that I arrived to study with Mr. Gammell, I was 18, and practically the first thing that he said to me was, if you do your memory drawing every day, you'll have the world in your hands. And he could not, you can't emphasize enough how much importance he put on memory drawing. I
There's
don't know if
a
that was your experience, Richard.
Well,
Go ahead,
first of all, if you're painting a landscape, you have to memorize the color effect that you see when it's at its peak, because landscape changes all the time. And what do you do when it changes? Well, then you work on composition, you the drawing and so forth. You wait till the lighting effect is right. You try to memorize that. So it's very important. Or same with a portrait. As you paint site size, I guess we're going to talk about that later. From a distance, you're looking at the subject and you're memorizing what you need to do in your mind, and then you walk up the canvas and put it down. So the side method is very good for memory training as well.
I wanted to ask about that, but before I do, I want to make a comment as well, which is the practical section in Twilight of Painting, where Gammell talks about how to study memory, reminded me a lot of the Cave method from the 19th century, where she essentially would have the students make a tracing and then try to make an exact replica, and then
Right.
use the tracing to test and to put everything away. And it was developed sometime, I think, in the 1880s. But also, the second comment is there's something to memory in structural drawing, which I find sometimes doesn't get enough coverage, because to recall something structurally is to sort of regenerate a memorized proportion or a certain kind of form and space. And I think that's part of it.
Mhm.
Yeah, Richard Lack would go out for walks with his dog and and study a scene, a landscape scene, and come back to his studio and paint it. Totally from memory. And he used, certainly like Richard, and used with landscape painting. You get the color is at its peak, it's fleeting, and
Very
you
fleeting.
work from memory.
The other aspect, the last thing about that I would want to add is there's the sort of alchemy that occurs between the imagination and the memory, where you remember only that which is essential, so you don't get lost in trivial details. You remember the big sweep, the big wholeness of something, and that's also a benefit of memory, that you're not a slave to nature per se, but you're remembering those things that are essential.
Excellent. I want to ask Darren something, and before we talk about site sizing, and it involves a question that I think I kind of mangled in the list. Essentially, what I was trying to do was go to Gammell's description of how much the 19th century had been vilified. And in Gammell's account, there were what he called really effective formulas in the hands of able painters that were interpreted later by teachers in the 20th century as pejorative, as roadblocks, as places you wouldn't want to go because it would imprison you in this system or that system. And the number one villain was Bouguereau. And even up to today, when you're in critique situations, there's a lot of talk about Bouguereau being the person that you don't want to emulate. And I don't think that's fair, for a variety of reasons. But I'd like to hear from your perspective, Darren, some thoughts about Bouguereau and how you interpret his work today, especially from your extensive experience as a teacher.
It's difficult. There's in terms of methods, and it's something I've talked about with a lot of students. When you walk into a museum and you see a Rembrandt, it's a Rembrandt immediately. You see a Bouguereau, it's a Bouguereau. You see any painter that's sort of well known, and it's their work immediately, which indicates that there's a formula there. That there is some sort of stylistic way that they're painting, that they're reproducing from painting to painting. that's part of their style. And the idea that that sort of painting methods and controlled palettes and things like that are bad seems to be not a great idea to me. The opposite side of that, and a lot of these things, something I've been experimenting with in my own studio is a bit, but you know, you walk into your studio and you set up a model and you have the same lighting every day. You know, you have the same north light and you've got the same trees outside of your studio and the color looks the same in your studio every day. So what happens when you leave that space and go somewhere else? How does that change the way that you're seeing color? It's something that I've noticed with several painters that I've worked with, is that quite often they will be working in their studio and doing a certain painting. They'll go to a different studio and work in a different painting with different lighting, but their painting looks exactly the same.
Yeah.
So there are sort of default methods of painting and color palettes that people use and value patterning that people use that seem smart in a way, dangerous in a way.
Mr. Gammell said there are many ways to skin a cat. So that, you know, there's more than one way to paint. I mean, there's thousands of ways to paint. It's really, you learn the craft, and then you try to find your own style, your own way of doing it. That's separate and different from your master, the master that you study with. You know, I think about all the people that study with Richard Schmidt. I mean, I can tell a Schmidling a mile away. They all copy his work, inevitably, and it's too bad. And I had to leave Mr. Gammell, otherwise he was essentially crushing my creativity. I had to leave him after a period of 5 years. Richard Lack did the same thing, and he wrote a number of letters to me urging me to leave Mr. Gammell when I did.
It's certainly true of almost any artist, though.
Right.
Weak artists make weak paintings. You know, people that are good, that are going to be kind of crushed by the sort of over influence of their teacher, are going to be crushed. You know,
Robert Cormier did a masterful Man in a Fur Collar pastel when he was 24. It was absolute masterpiece. After that, he told me Mr. Gammell never spoke to him the same way again.
Yeah, but at the same time,
you know, in my personal case, you know, the most important 2 days were the day I met Mr. Gammell and the day I left him. And I realized without Mr. Gammell, I'd be nobody. I owe him everything that I am. And I also am grateful that I left him before I had a complete nervous breakdown and gave up. It took, I call it Gammellitis. I hear Mr. Gammell in my head almost every day. It's not as strong as it used to be. So, you know, thank you, Mr. Gammell, but, you know, leave me alone. Let me be Richard Whitney, not Ives Gammell.
Yeah, I may add to that. I would like to say I'm very familiar with many of Richard Lack's graduates of his program and the work that they've done. Some of them are highlighted, all of them are highlighted in the catalog, but at least the top ones, and there could have been more included. And all of them found their own vision and found their own manner of painting. I mean, I think what Darren's bringing up can be a pitfall with working with one artist, especially those like Gammell, that can be very didactic in their training and can crush a person. Richard successfully extracted himself from that, and the voice in his head. So, yeah,
it's very, very painful.
Samson he's also having studied with Gammell and with Black and with originally with Alan Bates.
Yes.
He found his own voice. So it can be done, but yeah, a student needs to be careful and watch for that. And if there are begins to be any didactic approaches, or where they begin to feel that they're just getting smothered by the master in some way, the master, they should start looking
Absolutely.
for artists to study with.
Mhm.
I mean, from a student's perspective too, if you're studying with someone and you don't want their influence in your paintings, you're studying with the wrong person.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the good point. That is a good point.
It's a good point. I'd like to ask about site sizing then, Richard. If you could shed some light on where that comes from
Right.
as a training tool.
Yeah,
for
I'm
artists.
happy to do that. The lighting in this studio, the sound went off, all my settings on my camera went off too, so I apologize for that. I think I've got it back somewhat. I don't know how. But anyway, the site size, Charles Cecil, who studied with Gammell and then with Black, and now runs his own atelier in Florence, spent a long time studying and researching the history of site size. And the first account of site size is in the work of Sir William Rothstein, who uses the term site size for the visual method of comparing the canvas to the model to scale. And he speaks of John Singer Sargent, quote, Sargent, when he painted Sargent, when he painted the size of life, placed his canvas on a level with the model, walked back until canvas and sitter were equal before the eye, and was able to estimate the construction values of his representation. The placing of the canvas near to or at a given distance from the subject, so that the sitter and image can be compared together, is an essential factor of representational painting. Painters often deplore the loss of tradition and speak with regret of the days when artists ground their own colors, but the knowledge of visual methods of the older painters, rather than their technical practices, seems to me of equal, if not greater importance. The methods of Velázquez and Halls were not unlike Sargent's. And he goes back to Sir Joshua Reynolds. Excuse me, I lose my voice if I don't drink water. Reynolds advised his pupils to paint at the greatest possible distance from your sitter and to place your picture near the sitter so as to see both together. Sir Henry Rayburn, a wonderful portrait painter I admire very much, the sitter to Rayburn relates thus: having placed me in a chair on a platform at the end of his painting room in the posture required, he set up his easel beside me with a canvas ready to receive the color. When he saw all was right, he took his palette and brush, retreated back step by step with his face toward me till he was nigh at the other end of the room. He stood and studied for a minute more, then came up to the canvas and without looking at me, wrought upon the canvas with color for some time. Having done this, he retreated in the same manner, studied my looks at the distance for about another minute, came back hastily upon the canvas and painting a few more minutes. This whole approach was, this whole site-side approach was used by Gainsborough, Sir Thomas Lawrence, James McNeill Whistler, and Velázquez, and even Gainsborough. So it goes back for several centuries. It's not something that's new at all. It was practiced from Velázquez on, and Rembrandt, I believe, also did it occasionally as well.
And I think you can find that in Vermeer's work as well. And just to add about something more about Vermeer,
Yes.
Richard Lack referred to him as being an impressionist painter who used painting atmospheric color in his paintings very early on, before atmospheric color and impressionist painting was actually made into a specific way of painting. So the early masters had their own ways of bringing in atmosphere and color and so on.
So years ago, I did a demonstration at Grand Central Atelier because the name had changed, and I felt like I stepped on a third rail when I mentioned site sizing. And I do not wish to discourage it. I'm really interested in the thinking behind it, because it sounds to me quite a bit from the conversation we've had that the thinking is in part motivated by memory. Do you agree with that?
Well,
Training the memory,
Memory, their use of memory in site sizing.
training memory. Yeah.
well,
Having
it's,
training memory.
memory is used in walking back and forth to the canvas. But for instance, we did a lot of site-sized pencil drawings of the figure every day for months and months and months. And the size of the figure and we did was site-sized to what we were looking at.
Mm-hmm.
And the same with the charcoal drawing. We just placed it at a certain distance from the model, so it was large rather than small. The point with site size is you can easily tell your placements. You can easily check and correct yourself. I mean, it's either right or it's wrong. Whereas if you have to, you look up there, the image is very tiny and you have to blow it up to 10 inches high on your canvas back here, it's very difficult to get the placements right. And in a art school situation, it's very difficult to also set everything up so that somebody can do site size.
I think it's worth pointing out there's even within the Gammell students and the LAC students, there is a debate as to whether or not it's really a good thing to be a site size painter the rest of your life. I happen to think that what it really does in the very beginning, especially, is it wires your brain to see things, how they relate, and almost like a graph in your brain. And even if you don't end up using it, and I use it a lot less than I used to, it's in there. And even those that don't like it anymore or claim not to use it, they, at least some of them, have had the experience of having their brain wired by doing site size. So I think it's a critical component myself. I would encourage others to try it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think the
Program was based on the site size method, but he moved away from it, with some of his paintings, especially his interiors and other works that he did.
I think there's a historical version of site size that is very, very different from the modern version of site size. When Sargent was doing site size, he was doing visual comparisons from a distance.
Right.
He was not making a million tiny little measurements. When I was in school, we made 7 million tiny little measurements.
Yeah.
And the end result of that was really accurate but dead drawings.
Yes.
Drawings that had no life in them, no gesture. Site size can be very useful for certain things, but it is a major detriment to getting life into figure drawings in particular.
And that's where you'd have to break away from it.
Sorry?
And that's where you'd have to break away from it at a certain point.
Yeah. I've always thought it's a useful tool for teachers, for teaching things, but I had a big problem when I left the atelier and started going out and doing landscape paintings, and was just like, I don't know what to do. Like I only knew how to do things site size.
Oh.
And I was lost.
Well, you have the landscape in front of you, your canvas is placed as close to site size as you can. For comparison, but clearly the image is going to be a different size. It's going to be side by side, but a different size. It will help you to, you have your subject and your canvas here, and you step back and look at them both. At least you can get some idea of what capturing the real thing.
But that's
even if it's a different size, even if it's literally a different size, it still is helpful.
But it's not site size.
Correct. Not. Yeah. It is placed side by side, but it is not site size visually. No.
Right.
Yeah, and I would say that site size is most beneficial to the early students, first couple, 2-3 years of their studying. When you're getting into doing figurative work and doing figurative work that would result in like an interior, that's where you need to then start working. You might have done site size enough to have enough skill sets to be able to look at it without doing the actual detailed measuring, but still doing comparative comparisons to your canvas and a figurative scene that you've set up.
I've found, as DeCamp used to say too, Joseph DeCamp, who studied with Duveneck and became a Boston painter, used to say that it's the interpretation of form is the real struggle. You can get shapes down, you can learn to see shapes accurately, you can learn to see value relationships fairly accurately by drawing casts, but it's that interpretation of form that it was always his struggle, even late in his career. You have to interpret the form, and that's one of the things I really liked about this Cincinnati experience that I had. Is I think Duveneck had a leg up on understanding three-dimensional form in space and those planes that go back in space, the top of the head, the bottom of the head, and how do you suggest that those planes are receding and not coming forward? You can get the shape right, you can get the shape from here to here right, but unless you interpret the form well, you've lost it. You got a flounder instead of a three-dimensional head.
Great thing about enlarging it is you can access three-dimensional indications and signals in the structure and the anatomy, which can be difficult to access when site sizing because the scale is so far reduced.
You can be slavish to it too.
Yep.
I have a question from a colleague. I think it's for anyone, but it involves a colleague of mine up in New York named Kurt Cowper, who is a notable painter and a great painter. And he studied with Robert John Cormier, who you mentioned, who did that pastel. And he describes a drawing exercise, which he calls the, quote, nervous contour, that was practiced apparently by Cormier, maybe by others, and involves a very delicate kind of almost attention to the silhouette. And as I was trying to understand it, investigate it, it reminded me a lot of the quote from Nicolaides from the book from 1941, where he says, "Develop the absolute conviction that you are touching the model." Could anybody shed some light on the kind of lost nervous contour technique?
Well, Mr. Gammell would have us, let's say, rest our pinky on the paper, and with the pencil, as we're drawing the model, just very carefully, like looking at the model and kind of feeling it with your pencil, rather than making a carefully controlled line. It's more like you're just kind of searching it out. You know what I'm saying? And when you get the shape, then if you wish to smooth it out, go right ahead. But it's almost like a bit of a nervous line to it.
You know, there's a great drawing in the Cincinnati Art Museum by Bastien Lepage of Joan of Arc, and he does that very thing. You can see him literally searching the forms out. It's very, very fluid, really interesting.
There was a painting done by Sargent. I went to the Sargent exhibition here at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts with Richard Lack and another artist, and we went and viewed the entire collection that was on view. And there was a very interesting portrait painting that I think might touch on this skill set done by Sargent, and it was very unusual because you looked at the face, and then you would look at the body and the hands, and it was of a young man, a teenager, that he painted, and he painted by three-quarter view. And you could see as he went farther down, the hand that was draping on one side, he had his other hand, I think, in a pocket or something, holding his vest or his coat. The painting, the hand was almost like just this wispy kind of form. And I asked Richard Lack about that, and he said Sargent painted what Lack would call the perfect Impressionist portrait. Because when you're looking at the face, he said, look at the face of that painting, and view the entirety of the scene as you would when you're looking at a person you're talking to. And when you're looking at the person, gradually, as you move away from the person, things begin to start going into a more a different form and shape, and they represent themselves. When you're looking at a hand, looking at the person in their eyes, hanging down by them, it doesn't look like a hand until you actually look at it, and then it looks sharply like a hand. So what He said that what Sargent did there was painted the perfect Impressionist hand. And that had to have been done, I think, similar to what they're talking about, where it was probably more of like feeling the hand that he was painting as he was looking at his model without looking down at the hand. He was looking at the model and painting without looking at what he was painting. At least I sensed that's what it was.
Well, it's important to look at the work of Velázquez. Gammell called Velázquez the greatest impressionist. And you study Velázquez, his early work as a student, every little detail, plane, everything, very hard, sculptured out, very studied. He really wanted to get every shape as perfectly as he could. Later on, he loosened up. He broadened his vision out. And so that, the perimeter of your site, everything out there has less detail. If you put it in as much detail and as sharp a focus or whatever, it's not visually truthful. Let's put it that way. And I think too many realist painters put in too much detail all over the canvas. I think they make a mistake, and they don't do enough with studying edges and lost edges, especially where forms blur together. Where my hair disappears into the frame and the painting behind me and things like that, rather than having an edge to it. That sort of thing.
Yeah.
That's interesting. When you said earlier, Richard, that you thought that Gammell was going to crush your spirit, what did you mean?
Well, he did. He tried. I mean, after a while, when you got to be, as I said, when Cormier did his Man in the Fur Collar, it was clearly something that superior to what Mr. Gammell could do. And once you learned enough that you could compete with Mr. Gammell, it was a whole different matter. Richard Lack experienced the same thing. He had to get out of there after a couple of years. It's very unfortunate. Gammell did that with a lot of his students, which resulted in just a handful of them becoming successful painters, where Richard Lack, I think, was very kind and generous to everyone. He never cut people to shreds. For example, Sam Rose had studied with him, say, 8 or 9 years, and we were doing a figure drawing one day together, and Gammell came into the room, absolutely blew his top. And for 20 minutes, he screamed at Sam. He didn't know anything. He was a failure, so on and so forth, blah, 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 blah. And Gammell left, and Sam took me into another room and showed me a pencil drawing he'd done of a male nude. It was incredibly beautiful, So it was a thing that Gammell had, that he had to be number one. He had to be top dog. Everybody else was underneath him. So you had to leave him to try to find a way for yourself. And I think that's true of a lot of things. Michael Jackson's father, tormenting the guy. To make Michael Jackson a genius as an entertainer, but he tormented the guy. And the same with the great golfer. I forgot his name, but these people. Well, my mind goes blank. Amadeus Mozart, his father, towering over the guy. From early childhood on. Drove him. Finally, Mozart just drove Mozart crazy. He had to break away. The hell with what you want. I've got to find myself. I have to be myself, not you. And
I have to ask though. I mean, when I knew Dean Keller, who was just the most gentle human being, erudite, extraordinarily wise. He talked about how embittered his father had become.
Yes.
His dad running Yale art department during the transformation of the art world. And you hear, I mean, in some respect, Nelson was like an armored tank going through the studios. And I feel like that generation kind of had to be that way to survive.
I agree 100%. They had to be, exactly, extremely strong, I agree with that now. As a young man back then, it was just extremely painful to hear your hero, the man you loved, you wanted to dedicate your life to, tearing you apart. It was very hard to take. And several of his students committed suicide, that sort of thing. It was very unfortunate. But I do understand Gammell had to fight the entire modernist world almost single-handedly. When he wrote Twilight of Painting, he was not allowed to show his work in any museum show in the country after that. His career was over.
Yes, of course. And I hear in some of the really wonderful programs that Paul Ingridson puts out, how Gammell would lose his top over exhibition lighting on things. And so you love that. And at the same time, you recognize you have to keep that a little bit at arm's length.
I went to a show of Monet at the Metropolitan Museum under pink light. And so I happened to meet the lady in charge of the lighting. And I said, why is this under pink light? And she said, oh, the scientists and everything said, this is the ideal light. I said, Monet didn't paint under pink light. He painted under natural light. And the show it had was naturally lit overhead. And the pink lights are on the side. So I moved my hand. See, this is pink when the pink light was on. See, but it's really not pink. And I moved it to the light of the sky. And other people said, oh yeah, look at that. And she got so upset. She was trembling. And I thought, you couldn't see Monet's work under pink light. It's like listening to Beethoven with a string quartet that doesn't out of tune. To appreciate these great works of art, they need to be seen as much as possible in the light in which they were created, in which the artist created them. The Clark Museum remodeled their museum. It's atrocious. It looks like a military bunker. It's horrible. And Bouguereau and the other painters are now in a darkened room under sort of gaslight type effects. And they said, well, that's how the collectors looked at their paintings in their homes. But that's not how Bouguereau painted it. He had north light windows. You're looking at artwork under completely false circumstances. You can't possibly judge it, especially for someone who is very sensitive about how it should look, as I am, and everybody here is. It's a travesty, but the experts out there are telling us all how to run things.
I think there are some hopeful signs, though. I see.
Yes, there are.
Some museums are beginning to redo their skylights, and it's like walking into. There's the Butler Institute of American Art in Youngstown, for example. They have one room that is beautifully lit with daylight, and you just feel your spirits rise when you walk in there. All the colors are registering beautifully. The values. It's like listening to a symphony in Carnegie Hall versus like an underpass somewhere. It's extraordinary. Let's get back to that. It's a very simple concept. Skylights leak, fix them.
Right. And they don't take energy. They light from nature, for God's sakes.
Yeah.
Well, and this discussion is only relevant to the museums that still have, traditional art showing. You have just gone completely modern.
Mr. Gammell left a lot of money to the Boston Library to have the Sargent murals restored. And they were originally seen under a skylight there and so forth. But the experts restored the murals and they invited Mr. Gammell to the opening. And he looked at it a little while. And he started right in. You stupid idiots, the lighting is wrong. Everything is wrong. The color of the wall is wrong. That's not what Sargent wanted. And he was right about everything. That's not what Sargent wanted. And one of the problems with the art world is you have many painters study history at Yale and so forth. For example, Charles Cecil, he was getting his master's at Yale. And he wanted to take a course in painting. They wouldn't let him. How can he be an art historian and not know anything about how an artist paints? how can he possibly be a historian? How can he judge anything if he doesn't know the craft? But they wouldn't let him take a painting course. So he dropped out of Yale. And as that sort of thing,
Fortune.
I mentored a student recently who was getting his master's degree from a major school art institute. And you know what they did for the last 2 years to get a master's degree? They studied art theory and wrote term papers. Not one course on the craft of painting or advanced figure work, not one critique. So I spent my time critiquing his work and trying to help him advance his technique. But a lot of the schools out there today want you to unlearn everything and create and focus all your mind and attention on that artist statement, you know, the bullshit that you write. My theory is the longer the artist statement, always the worse the work of art, always, forever.
Tell us how you really feel, Richard.
Yeah.
I let it out after a while. It's frustrating because there's so much ignorance. There's so much, and it's sad because I don't think they mean to be ignorant. They just think they've got their PhD from Yale, so they know everything about art. Excuse me, Yale was one of the big places that did their best to destroy classical painting.
Well, I want to say too, though, we have a whole population of individuals now who understand what you're talking about from the standpoint of hope and knowledge and resetting the paradigm of understanding and observation and looking back, seeing to it that they know when they get their master's degree, they're going to learn how to paint as well as learn how to write. And that makes me optimistic. I think that those people eventually do become the writers and the professors and the chairs of tomorrow. So my last question for you all, because I know this has been a while, your time has been so generous, but I want to ask you, what are your thoughts about the future, each and every one of you? What do you want to see as a result of this training, which has changed over the years, but really is going to a place where it's embraced in a grassroots capacity?
Well, before I lose my voice, certainly everyone here should look at Art Renewal Center. There's probably 150 or so recognized living masters, of which I'm one of them. There's an awful lot of talent out there. There's some really superb artists. Unlike years ago, where only a handful of old men primarily. As I say, I think the future for learning how to paint is very hopeful. The issue now is to get very wealthy people, Elon Musk or whatever, buy a Bouguereau or whatever. Sylvester Stallone bought Bouguereaus. Michael Jackson bought Bouguereau because they were cheap at the time, because Bouguereau was regarded as a hack illustrator in the early part of the century. There's a story about Andrew Lloyd Webber when he was a very young man. He saw Flaming June by Lord Leighton. It was in a window in a shop for 150 pounds. So he went to his grandmother, said, I don't have that money, but Grammy, can you loan me the money? I'll earn it back and so forth. I'll pay you back. She said, I don't want that academic crap in my house. Okay, 30 years later, Andrew Lloyd Webber is a world-renowned, composer and so forth. He visits Puerto Rico, and at the Ponce Museum in Puerto Rico, there's Flaming June. So he went to the curator and said, I'll buy that painting for $5 million. And he said, no. 10 million, no. 15 million, no. 20 million, I'll give you 20 million for it. The curator said, it's not for sale. So there is hope if some of the great works that we produce start getting real money, the world's going to look at us. As long as they think the banana taped to a wall is a work of art, we're in trouble. But I think there's enough there are enough of us out there now, especially the young people, who realize that when they're sold a bunch of goods that is crap. The future, I think, looks quite positive.
I see a just in sort of wrapping it up, one great benefit to what it is that we all do, and is that devotion to poetic and natural appearances is very much what this world needs right now. We're also wrapped up in our virtual lives. Here we are on a screen, and there's obviously great things to be said about it. But what we need is an antidote where we reconnect with something real and grounded. And that's what this painting tradition does, is do it in a big way. And I see it as a great corrective, and it's exactly what we need, is to show people what a sensitive vision looks like and what nature looks like via that vision, and to embrace that. And then I would add just one last thing. In addition to ARC, there's also going to be a new group, the Gammell and Lack Institute of American Painting. Those that are interested in this sort of very focused origin via R.H. Ives, Gammell, and Richard Lack, they should check out that, do a Google search and check it out.
One last comment from me, knowing what I know of the training and so forth, when I go out and on rare occasions, I liken it to baseball. You try to get on first base if you can. Oftentimes you strike out. Sometimes you get on first, sometimes you get on second, third. Once in a while you hit a home run. Once in a while you hit a grand slam. When you capture the beauty of nature and you've really done it extremely well, it is extremely joyful. You're in ecstasy. And it's the same true with the portrait. When you've done a good job, you know it. You really know when you knocked it out of the park. You know, if there's anybody out there with any eyes to see, they'll see that your work holds up with any of the others who have come before. Part of that tradition.
And touching and building off of what Richard just said, and then I'll go on to add my comments about this topic. Richard Lack, and this is published in the catalog, Richard Lack had an epiphany at one point. He originally struggled a lot with capturing the natural color and the depth of color in nature. Don Kestner opened him up and was really instrumental in helping him be able to begin to see it. And there was a time when many years later, and Richard continued painting landscapes and painted wonderful ones, but there came a point where he came home one day and he sat down with Catherine and he says, I have to share with you an experience that I just had. It was almost spiritual. It was almost like I was looking at nature through the eyes of God. Yes. And saw nature as God created it, filled with the wonder of color and light and atmosphere. And his ability to paint landscapes was significantly improved after that particular experience. It's amazing. I mean, I had some wonderful conversations with Richard over the years, but that one really stands out. But going on about the training and where is this going in the future of it? Well, I think simply stated, there'll be a future for it as long as people are interested in seeing the work and buying the work.
Yes.
That has changed dramatically since I first met Richard Lack, and we started the American Society of Classical Realism. There were very few ateliers. There wasn't a big market. The biggest market for realistic art was Western art. Mm-hmm. And that just kind of had kept somewhat of the life going. And then wildlife art was kind of still had a following and was successful, and people could make a living doing that. But Richard, when his students first set out, they struggled. They would find work at night as janitors or whatever, and they would paint during the day, and they would try to work out the means to get their work in front of an audience. And gradually, if they persisted and worked at it, they found ways to do that. And some became quite successful, but it wasn't easy. It was much harder than it might be even today, and it's not easy today. So, but what we saw was like an epiphany, a change in the art world and in the culture of art with the modernists. And the modernism is on the way out.
Yes.
And more and more, the pendulum is swinging back to realism and realistic painting and the various forms that can take. And that's also where I think it's really critically important for young artists to be encouraged to paint works that are grounded in nature, but at the same time speak to today's issues.
Mhm.
You know, the beautiful work is beautiful work, and that always will find a market, and that's important. But also work that then begins, like, you know, the early 19th century artists, they were doing masterworks and large historical paintings or religious paintings and allegorical paintings and paintings of mythology. That was important to an upper class of the society. And those artists would be rewarded and supported, and their works would be purchased and put on display in museums and at the École des Beaux-Arts and so on. We haven't reached that state yet. But that's kind of where this needs and where it can grow, eventually grow and reach to as a pinnacle, is to replicate what was going on in the French academies and the French salons of mid to late 19th century France.
No.
But have gone where the artwork now, the structure and how people paint has graduated into a much more sophisticated form of including atmospheric light and color into academic skills with drawing and painting. The blend of the two, that's the Boston school. And the Boston Impressionists did it much more successfully than the French Impressionists ever did.
Mhm.
The French Impressionists, their work actually
Overrated. It's overrated.
You know, yeah, it was overrated, and the modernists kept going with how can we separate ourselves even more and more and more farther away from the academics and realism and all that the academics stood for.
Yeah.
And that's modernism today. You know, where you see a gold toilet bowl at the Carnegie Museum or whatever, the Guggenheim Museum of Art, and people were encouraged to go up and pee in it.
Yeah.
It was a working toilet on exhibit, and that it made it gold. So you're pissing into and it was like it was supposed to represent society today or the capitalistic, you know, culture that we live in today and focus on money. So, at any rate, that's why I see the future. I see a bright, incredibly big future, but the artists are going to have to step up and start filling some of those voids. And the public needs to become more educated. But I think wealthy people, and that's important, are becoming more and more supportive.
Um,
I'm-
one comment, when Obama was president, you know, as much as I admire many things about him, he filled the White House with the modernist stuff. And he gave Nolan, the abstract painter Nolan, the medal for contribution.
Medal of Freedom.
Medal of Freedom. Okay. My mother, my birth mother, knew him very well. And you know about Nolan? His gallery has a contract with him. You are to paint X number of paintings by such and such dimensions with such and such colors arranged in such and such manner. He had to reproduce what the gallery wanted ad nauseum. You know that, and you know that just is an example of how corrupt the system today has become. And there's so many, yes, there's so many good things going on now. I think the future is very, very bright for realist painters.
Yeah, and Richard Lack's students that have been given, you know, opportunities and or not contracts, but what I'm searching for the right word, not a contract, but when an artist, when a person, you know, contracts, huh?
Commission.
Commission.
Yeah, commissions of work. There had been a group that were a very wealthy person in Texas, Dallas, Texas, and I won't say his name because I don't want to necessarily shed light on anything that he wouldn't want to be well known. But he's a very successful man, a multi-billionaire, as a matter of fact. And he's commissioned several artists to do works in his historical buildings down in Dallas. And numerous artists have gained commissions from him over the years. So Stephen Jertson being one of them, probably one of the prime ones, but Richard Whitney, or not, excuse me, not Richard Whitney, uh, uh, Kirk Richards,
I was going to say Kirk Richards.
Carl Samson, the list goes on. I don't know, Carl, did you get a commission by any chance?
I did two for him. Yeah.
You were included in that.
Yeah. It was a great experience. Really.
Yeah. So that can be more of those, kinds of situations with people that are wealthy that value history and historical in the history of architectural as well as art. Become can support artists in that manner and give them commissions, as they did in the old Renaissance and in the 19th century.
What is happening here and there is wealthy people are starting to buy what they like.
Yes.
Rather than listening to some expert.
Right.
And the Clark Museum is a great example of a wonderful collection of 19th century painting, because they bought what they liked.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard it also phrased, buy art with your eyes, not your ears. Some people buy art with their ears. So
yeah,
most people do. Most people do because it's, in to have a Nolan stripe in your house, because wealthy people have Nolans on the wall.
Richard always said it was tried to be very even-handed regarding modernism, where he would say, modernists have their own tradition and we have ours.
Yes. They're different kinds of fruit.
As a longer,
it's a different art. It's a different art form, and we have no business really tearing them apart. They have no business tearing us apart either. We should coexist. We should coexist.
The only reaction I give, and I know Richard Lack would give, is that modernism dominated the art museum and the whole gallery business to the point where everything that wasn't modernism was suppressed and was trite and not important whatsoever. And if you love something because it was beautiful, it's like, well, what's wrong with you? That's not an intellectual reason to buy something, So yeah, that I would say it's because of that. And if they start to die out, then from my point of view, they deserve what they get.
Yeah.
Darren, I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Go ahead. Yes, sorry. Go ahead.
From my point of view, the difference that I'm seeing is that artists are coming out of school now and they are expected to be technically proficient.
Good.
I can definitely remember when I was in school around 2000 being just amazed when we saw an artist that was technically proficient. And it's gotten to the point now that technically proficient is not good enough anymore. Wow. Artists have to have something to say. Mm-hmm. And having something to say is what's going to bring in collectors. Mm-hmm. Just being able to paint a copy of a Bouguereau with a modern model in it is bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
It's not good enough, So a lot of these artists that I'm seeing coming out now that are extremely well trained, but are also finding their own voice, finding the way they want to paint, finding what they want to say in their paintings, and seeing some of these people coming out now that are really kind of seeing their careers take off is to me very important. That we're seeing people cross over into leaving sort of the tiny little realist galleries and sort of moving out into other parts of the art world, but not compromising what they're painting. Is very interesting to me.
I'm losing my skylight there, but this other light is still on. I keep having to move it closer. Anyway, a very cute story. Fred Ross has a major collection of 19th century work, Bouguereaus and Lord Leighton's and everything on this corridor. And his 10-year-old son said, "Dad, why don't you hang one of my crayon drawings in a nice gold leaf frame and put it on the gallery?" So he put it down at the end of the hall, a crayon drawing that he did in a gold leaf frame. Well, the curator of the Museum of Modern Art in New York visited Fred, and he's looking down at the Bouguereaus and the Lord Leightons, and all of a sudden he runs down the hall. "Oh my God, an early Frank Stella," as he runs down to the 10-year-old, and Fred says, "Sorry, that's a crayon drawing by my 10-year-old son."
That says it all.
That says it all, isn't it wonderful?
There's a, yeah, I really love what you said, Darren. There's a Burge Harrison quote from an Art Students League lecture that he conducted around 1911 when he said, "The only artwork which should endure is that which is true to the spirit of its own age." So to me, that is exactly what you're encapsulating when you say somebody painting a Bouguereau painting in 2022. It's not the spirit of this age anymore. So I agree completely. Gentlemen, I think this has been a wonderful evening. I've learned a ton. I really want to thank you all for being here. Darren Kingsley, Gary Christensen, Richard Whitney, Carl Samson. I encourage the audience to look at the work, the writing, and the painting and the drawing of these luminaries and stay in touch with them and stay in touch with us while you're at it. This has been the last finale lecture and presentation of the Bennett-Schmidt lectures on the higher aim of art for the year 2021 to 2022, and it's been a great one. And while you're at it, come and visit us at Studio Incominati at some point this summer, and don't be a stranger. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you very much. I'm fading into the dark. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you.
Right.
Been fun.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Gary.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you, Darren. Take care.